Of course, we're just days away from seeing the Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine roll out to two populations here in terms of healthcare workers and susceptible populations in nursing homes. But we're seeing companies line up here in fast order to start advocating for certain workers within their realm here. One of those companies and leaders being the CEO of Uber, Dara Khosrowshahi, taking to Twitter to advocate here, pointing out the fact that he's asked governors in all 50 states, as well as D.C., to prioritize drivers and delivery people for early vaccine access, saying that frontline workers should get the vaccine before people like him. And Aikiko, I mean, that does become the question. Some people are pointing out that, look, you're advocating for workers. That's good. Important not to call them employees, though. They're contractors in the eyes of Uber. But what do you make of this? Because I guess it shouldn't come as a surprise, considering how big of a role companies have been playing from climate change to other important issues, that they would be advocating for their own workers here.
Yeah, and I think that the broader question is, how do you define essential worker right now? Because we know who's going to get the vaccines in the first phase of the rollout, which are healthcare workers as well as nursing homes. And then the phase two is about essential workers, but that necessarily hasn't been defined. And Uber certainly not the only company that has been advocating on the behalf of their own employees. We have the American Bankers Association coming out and calling for bank tellers and employees of rural banking branches to be designated as essential workers so they can get the vaccine. Also, the CEO of Purdue Farms writing to the CDC as well as state leaders saying that the government should prioritize meat and poultry industry workers for vaccine distribution. Of course, they experienced a significant outbreak early on in the pandemic. So this is all born out of concern these companies have as they try to continue to operate during this pandemic, especially at a time when we have seen a record number of cases, deaths, as well as hospitalizations. I think it's certainly going to be natural, but it is interesting to see just how hard the lobbying has been to the CDC to try and be the next in line for this vaccine. And of course, Zack, to your point earlier, even if they do, in fact, get that designation as an essential worker, any one of these companies, it's going to be up to the worker themselves unless it is required. And there's still a lot of skepticism around just the safety of the vaccine right now.
And specifically in the case of Uber, not just letters being sent to the CDC, also to U.S. President-elect Joe Biden as well there. But I guess it is interesting when you try and break it down and say, all right, who is going to be essential? I mean, you think about what President Trump did earlier in the pandemic using the Defense Production Act to kind of make sure that meat production did take place, despite the fact that you said, I mean, we saw workers there at some of these plants not only contract COVID-19, but die as well. So at least you would expect or hope that if they were deemed essential then, that they would be kind of moved up to the front of the line in terms of getting the vaccine. But it does become a very tricky question. And it raises questions, too, as to who's going to be deciding all this. I suppose Operation Warp Speed and the efforts there would be continued to kind of investigate which ones deserve the most coverage. But breaking out company by company, we saw how touchy things got in terms of the PPP program and some larger companies getting prioritized there. What that might do in terms of public opinion here as we learn more about who's to get it first.
Yeah, I mean, transparency is really going to be key here because this incoming administration certainly doesn't want to even make it seem as though they are accruing favors with individual companies because of the lobbying that they did. So that's going to be key at a time when there is still going to be a limited number of vaccines that are available. We've talked about the 20 million people that are likely to be inoculated by the end of the year. By the end of February, we're talking about roughly 100 million people, not even close to covering the overall population here. So expect that conversation to continue here. And then more messaging, you would think, from the White House as well as the FDA, the CDC, to say, well, here's why we decided these are the essential workers that need to get vaccinated first. Talk about grocery workers. And that's going to be another big group that certainly has been on the front lines throughout this pandemic. Many people have been affected with the coronavirus as well. So it's going to be interesting to see how these conversations play out.
Yeah, and I mean, we've seen them referred to as heroes, and now we'll see if they also get the same nod.